High-interest debt doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like a monthly payment. A manageable number, something that fits into the budget, something that gets paid each month without dramatically disrupting the financial picture. And that manageability, that feeling that the situation is under control, is what makes high-interest debt so structurally damaging over time. Because the damage isn't visible month to month, it's visible over years. And by the time it becomes visible, the compounding has already done most of its work. The mechanics of high-interest compounding work against the borrower in the same way compounding works for the investor, but in reverse. An investor's compounding builds on itself. Returns generate returns. The base grows. The returns grow on the larger base. High-interest debt compounds the same way. The balance generates interest. Unpaid interest is added to the balance. The larger balance generates more interest. The interest compounds on the larger balance. The direction is opposite. The mechanism is identical, which means the borrower carrying a high-interest balance is experiencing the most powerful financial force available, compounding, working against their position with the same relentlessness it works for the investor. The numbers make this concrete. A $5,000 credit card balance at 20% interest, carried with minimum payments only, doesn't cost $5,000. It costs significantly more, and it takes significantly longer to retire than most people realize when they take it on. The minimum payment covers roughly the interest accrued plus a small portion of principal, which means the principal declines slowly, while the interest continues compounding on a balance that barely moves. Years pass. Payments are made consistently, and the balance, despite those payments, remains stubbornly large. Because the payments are servicing the interest more than they're retiring the debt. This is how minimum payment structures work. They're designed, by the lender, to maximize the interest paid over the life of the balance. A minimum payment that keeps the borrower in debt for the longest possible period generates the most interest revenue for the lender, which is why minimum payments are set at the level that services the interest while retiring principal as slowly as possible, without pushing the borrower into default. It's not accidental. It's structural. The minimum payment is designed to produce maximum interest extraction from the borrower's position. The opportunity cost compounds the direct cost. Every dollar paid in high interest is a dollar not deployed elsewhere, not invested, not building a position, not compounding toward something. Just gone, transferred to the lender as the price of having borrowed at a high rate. And the opportunity cost of that dollar, what it would have compounded into over the same period, is the invisible cost of high-interest debt that never appears on any statement. The statement shows the interest paid. It doesn't show the wealth that interest payment prevented from being built. Make sure to subscribe. This is the kind of content that doesn't get made enough. Compounding is a neutral mechanism. It doesn't care which direction it's pointed. In an investment, compounding builds. Each period's return adds to the base. The base grows. The next period's return grows with it. In a high-interest debt position, compounding extracts. Each period's interest adds to the balance. The balance grows. The next period's interest grows with it. The same mathematical force, applied in opposite directions, with the same relentlessness in both. The specific behavior of compounding interest on debt has a property most borrowers don't fully internalize. The cost accelerates over time if the balance isn't being actively reduced. In the early months of carrying a balance, the interest cost is based on the original balance. It's real, it's ongoing, but it feels manageable. As months pass without significant reduction, the interest adds to the balance. The new balance generates more interest. The cost per month increases slightly. The borrower making the same minimum payment is covering less principal each month because more of the payment is going to the increased interest on the larger balance. The debt becomes harder to retire the longer it's carried, not easier. The acceleration effect is most visible when the math is run over a decade. Most people who carry credit card balances don't think about what that balance costs over 10 years. They think about the monthly payment. But the monthly payment is just the surface cost. The real cost is the sum of all interest paid over the entire period the balance is carried, plus the opportunity cost of what that capital could have compounded into elsewhere. Run that math on a moderate balance at a typical high interest rate over 10 years, and the number is almost always significantly larger than the original balance. Sometimes a multiple of it. The borrower borrowed $5,000. They paid back $15,000. The difference went to the lender, extracted from the borrower's position, month by month, compounding continuously for a decade. This is what makes high-interest debt a wealth extraction mechanism. Not because it takes everything at once, but because it takes something continuously. Every month, whether the borrower is paying attention or not, whether the economy is good or bad, whether the borrower's income has grown or not. The interest compounds against the position with the same consistency that a well-managed investment compounds for it. And the asymmetry between the wealth being extracted by the high-interest balance and the wealth that could be building if that capital were deployed differently is the real cost of carrying high-interest debt over time. Most people carrying high-interest balances don't think of themselves as paying a wealth tax. But structurally, that's what it is. A continuous extraction of capital from their position to someone else's. Compounding, month after month, in the background, while life continues normally and the monthly payment feels manageable. The crisis isn't visible, because it doesn't arrive as a crisis. It arrives as a statement at the end of a decade, showing how much was paid for the privilege of carrying a balance. The compounding that works against the high-interest debt holder can be interrupted. Not easily, not without trade-offs, but structurally, it can be stopped. And stopping it, even partially, changes the financial trajectory more significantly than most people realize when they're inside it. The first thing that changes the trajectory is understanding the actual cost. Not the monthly payment, the total cost over the life of the balance, including the compounding interest and the opportunity cost of capital deployed elsewhere. Most people don't run this math. They manage the monthly payment, not the total cost. And managing the monthly payment produces decisions optimized for short-term cash flow rather than long-term financial position. Running the actual math, the total interest paid over 3, 5, 10 years, produces a different emotional relationship with the debt. It makes the cost visible in a way the monthly statement obscures. And visible costs produce different decisions than invisible ones. The second thing that changes the trajectory is attacking the highest rate balance first. Not the smallest balance, the highest rate. The highest rate balance is extracting the most wealth per dollar of principal. Every dollar applied to that balance immediately reduces the rate of extraction. The mathematical case for prioritizing the highest rate is clear. The money saved in interest by eliminating the highest rate balance first exceeds the money saved by eliminating smaller balances first, regardless of how satisfying the psychological win of closing a smaller account feels.
Rate first, always, if the objective is minimizing total cost. The third thing that changes the trajectory is any reduction in the interest rate itself. Balance transfers, personal loans at lower rates, negotiating directly with the lender. A balance at 20% transferred to a product at 0% for an introductory period stops the compounding entirely during that period. Every dollar of payment goes directly to principal. No interest accumulates. The balance declines at the full payment amount, not at the payment amount minus interest. This is the most efficient form of debt reduction available when it's accessible. The interest rate reduction changes the mechanics entirely. The broader principle is simple. High-interest debt compounds against position. The only responses that change that are reduce the rate, increase the payment, or eliminate the balance. Everything else is managing the symptom without addressing the mechanism. And the mechanism, compounding interest on a carried balance, doesn't stop on its own. It doesn't get easier to manage with time. It gets harder. Because the compounding that makes long-term investing so powerful applies with equal force to the balance sitting on the credit card statement. Working for the investor, against the debt holder, with the same relentlessness, in opposite directions. If this reframed how you're thinking about it, subscribe. Like this if it landed.
Most people define financial freedom by a number, a specific amount in the bank, a portfolio value, a net worth figure that feels large enough to signal arrival. And the pursuit of financial freedom becomes the pursuit of that number. Earn more, save more, invest more, until the number is reached and the freedom presumably follows. But financial freedom isn't a number. It's a structural condition. And the difference between those two definitions changes what gets built, and whether the building actually produces what it was supposed to produce. The structural definition of financial freedom is specific, the condition in which the obligations of your financial life are met by income that doesn't require your active presence to generate. Not the condition of having a lot of money, not the condition of a high net worth. The condition in which the ongoing cost of your life, housing, food, transportation, the recurring obligations that exist regardless of whether you work, is covered by income that arrives without your direct labor. Passive income, investment income, business income that runs without your daily involvement. Whatever the source, the defining characteristic is the absence of the requirement to show up and work for the money to arrive. This distinction matters because a large number doesn't automatically produce this condition. A person with $2 million in a savings account earning minimal interest, living on a lifestyle that costs more than that interest generates, is not financially free. They have a large number. They're depleting it. Every month, the number shrinks. Every month, the runway to the point where the money runs out gets shorter. That's not freedom. That's a countdown. A person with $400,000 in a portfolio generating 6% annually, living a lifestyle that costs $20,000 a year, is financially free. The income covers the obligations, without their presence, indefinitely. The number is smaller. The condition is real. Financial freedom is about the ratio, not the absolute number. The ratio between income that doesn't require presence and obligations that require income to be met. When passive income exceeds obligations, the structural condition of freedom exists. Not comfort, not luxury, not the ability to do anything imaginable.
the specific structural condition in which continued presence in the labor market is optional, not required. That optionality is what freedom actually is, not the feeling of having enough. The structural reality of not needing to show up for the financial foundation to hold. Most people never reach this condition, not because they don't earn enough, but because they build toward the wrong target. They accumulate assets without examining whether those assets generate income. They build net worth without building income-producing position. They reach the number they imagined was freedom and discover that the number, without the income structure underneath it, is just a large savings account with a finite runway. The structural condition of freedom requires building income, specifically income that doesn't require presence. Not just accumulating assets, not just reaching a net worth target. Building the income-generating capacity that makes the presence optional.
If nobody in your life is talking about this, subscribe. Someone should be. Income and freedom are not the same thing. Most people assume they're on the same continuum, that more income leads eventually to freedom. And in one narrow sense, that's true. Higher income generates more surplus. More surplus can be deployed into income-producing assets. More income-producing assets can eventually cover obligations. But the path from high income to freedom is not automatic, and most high earners never complete it. High income creates a specific structural risk that's rarely discussed directly: lifestyle inflation. As income rises, the lifestyle that feels normal tends to rise with it. The apartment becomes a house, the house becomes a larger one, the car becomes a better one, the vacations become more frequent and more expensive, the children's schools, the experiences, the conveniences, all of them calibrate upward to match what the income can support. And what the income can support becomes what the income is required to support. The high earner's obligations have expanded to meet the income, which means the income is no longer surplus, it's required. And required income is not the same as freedom. It's dependency at a higher level. This is the trap of the high income without the structure underneath. The obligations require the income. The income requires the presence. The presence is therefore not optional. The high earner who stops working doesn't maintain their lifestyle on investment income, because the investment income was never built to cover a lifestyle calibrated to a high salary. They have to keep working, not because they're poor, because the structure of their financial life was built entirely on earned income, and the obligations that accumulated around that earned income require it to continue. High income, high obligations. No passive income covering those obligations, no freedom. The path from high income to freedom requires a specific intervention, deliberately not allowing lifestyle to consume the entire income, protecting a portion, deploying it into income-producing assets, allowing the income from those assets to accumulate rather than absorbing it into lifestyle. This is structurally simple. It's behaviorally difficult, because the income that could build freedom is also the income that could fund a better lifestyle right now. And the lifestyle improvement is immediate and visible. The freedom it prevents is distant and invisible. Which is why most high earners choose the lifestyle and find themselves at peak income years with high obligations, minimal passive income, and no structural alternative to continued work. The income was always large enough to build freedom. The structure was never built to convert that income into it. Not because of ignorance, because the immediate rewards of lifestyle expansion consistently outweigh the distant rewards of structural freedom, until the moment when the absence of freedom becomes a visible cost. And by then,
The obligations have been building for years. The passive income has not. The gap between what's required and what the passive income covers is significant. And closing that gap from a position of high obligations and minimal passive income is harder than it would have been from a position of moderate obligations and a deliberate build toward income-producing assets.
The structural condition of financial freedom gets built the same way any compounding position gets built. Slowly, deliberately, through consistent decisions that prioritize the income-producing asset over the lifestyle improvement it could alternatively fund. Not dramatically, not through sacrifice that's unsustainable, through a consistent margin, protected from lifestyle expansion, deployed into positions that generate income independent of presence. The first structural requirement is knowing the target, not a net worth number, an income number. What does this lifestyle cost annually? What passive income would be required to cover that cost indefinitely without depleting the principal generating it? That number, the annual passive income required, is the actual target, not the portfolio value in the abstract, the income-generating capacity the portfolio needs to produce. Working backward from that number, to the asset base required to generate it, to the surplus required to build that asset base, to the timeline that surplus produces, gives a structural picture of what freedom actually costs to build. The second structural requirement is protecting the surplus, not the surplus that's left over after lifestyle, a predetermined portion of income taken off the table before lifestyle decisions are made. The lifestyle builds from what remains, not from what's available before the allocation. This reversal, paying the income-producing asset first, living from the rest, is the structural mechanism that prevents lifestyle inflation from consuming the entire income. The surplus doesn't grow by earning more and hoping something is left. It grows by taking it first and building lifestyle from the remainder. The third structural requirement is deploying the surplus into income-producing assets, not savings accounts, not assets that store value without generating income. Income-producing positions, dividends, rental income, business income that doesn't require daily presence, portfolio income from investments structured to generate ongoing returns. Each deployment builds the passive income number. Each increase in the passive income number moves the structural condition of freedom closer. The distance to freedom isn't measured in years of additional income. It's measured in the gap between current passive income and the passive income required to cover obligations. Close that gap through consistent surplus deployment into income-producing positions, and the structural condition eventually arrives. It doesn't arrive as a moment. It arrives as a threshold crossed quietly, when the passive income first exceeds the obligations, when the presence becomes optional for the first time. And that threshold, crossed through consistent structural building rather than through a windfall or a number, is more durable than any lump sum, because it was built from income-producing capacity, not from accumulated savings being depleted. The asset base keeps generating. The obligations keep being covered. The presence stays optional. Indefinitely. Subscribe if this is the framework you've been missing. Like this if it reframed the target. Most people's relationship with debt is shaped by the context in which they first encountered it. Consumer debt, credit card balances, car loans, buy now, pay later arrangements for things that depreciated before the first payment cleared. And from that experience, debt becomes associated with a specific feeling: obligation, constraint, the weight of owing something to someone who has power over the terms, which makes it difficult to evaluate debt clearly as what it structurally is, rather than through the emotional residue of how it was first experienced. Debt is a financial instrument, not inherently good, not inherently destructive. An instrument with specific mechanical properties: a cost, the interest rate; a term, the repayment period; a function, determined by what it's used for. The instrument itself is neutral. What determines its effect is what it's attached to. A hammer isn't good or bad. It builds or it damages, depending on what it's used on and how it's used. Debt works the same way. The same instrument, at the same rate, with the same terms, produces completely different financial outcomes depending on its function. This distinction is obscured by how debt is culturally framed. In most financial conversations, especially in mainstream personal finance content, debt is presented as something to be eliminated. All debt, as fast as possible, regardless of its function or its cost. And for a specific category of debt, high-interest consumer debt, that's reasonable guidance. But applied universally to all debt without examining its function, that framing produces decisions that are structurally wrong. The person who pays off a 3% mortgage instead of investing in an asset generating 7% because they've been told debt is bad is making a structurally incorrect decision that costs them real money over time. Not because debt is good, because the function of that debt and its cost relative to the alternatives makes carrying it the better financial choice. Understanding debt as an instrument requires separating two questions that most people conflate. Is this debt costing me money? And is this debt the best use of the financial capacity it represents? The first question addresses the rate, the interest cost, the ongoing obligation of servicing the debt. The second question addresses the function. What is the debt funding? What does the thing it's funding produce? Is that production greater than the cost of the debt? A debt that costs 3% annually, attached to an asset that returns 7%, is not costing money. It's generating a net 4% on the spread between the cost and the return. The same debt, attached to a depreciating consumer purchase, is simply a cost. There's no return on the other side, just the obligation. The instrument is identical. The outcomes are opposite. One builds position, one extracts wealth. The difference isn't in the debt itself, it's in what the debt is doing, what it's attached to, what it's producing, what the relationship is between its cost and its function. That distinction between debt as a building instrument and debt as a consumption instrument is the foundation of understanding how debt actually works, and how the same thing can be the most useful financial tool available in one context and the most destructive one in another. Before this continues, if you felt seen instead of sold to, that's the entire point of Relentless Wealth. Like the video, subscribe. We're just getting started. Not all debt is the same. Not because the instrument differs, because the function does. And the function, what the debt is attached to, what it produces, whether that production exceeds its cost, is what determines whether debt builds or destroys financial position over time. Productive debt has a specific definition: debt that funds something that generates a return greater than the cost of the debt itself. A mortgage on a rental property that generates net cash flow above the debt service cost? Productive debt. The property produces more than the debt costs to carry.
A business loan that funds operations generating revenue with margins above the interest cost. Productive debt. The business produces more than the debt costs. A student loan that funds education leading to income substantially higher than it would have been without the credential. Potentially productive debt. If the income differential exceeds the debt cost over time. In each case, the debt is attached to something that produces a return, and the return exceeds the cost, which means the debt is net positive to the financial position. Destructive debt is structurally different. It funds things that don't produce returns, or that produce returns far below the cost of the debt. Credit card debt at 20% interest, carried to fund consumer spending. Destructive debt. The spending produced no return. The 20% compounds against the balance, extracting wealth with every passing month. A car loan on a vehicle that depreciates immediately. Destructive debt. The asset loses value faster than the debt is paid down. The net position worsens continuously until the loan is retired. Buy now, pay later arrangements for purchases that produced no lasting value. Destructive debt. The enjoyment of the purchase is front-loaded. The cost continues, with no return on the other side. The distinction isn't about the amount. A large, productive debt is structurally better than a small, destructive one. A $1 million mortgage on a property generating positive cash flow is a productive instrument, regardless of its size. A $500 credit card balance at 22% interest, carried month to month, is a destructive one. Small in absolute terms, but compounding against the holder at a rate that extracts meaningful wealth over time. The amount is less relevant than the function. The function determines whether the debt is working for the holder or against them. Most people carry both kinds simultaneously. Productive debt, a mortgage, a business loan, and destructive debt, credit card balances, consumer financing, at the same time. And the destructive debt operates continuously against the position, compounding interest against the holder, while the productive debt is generating returns on the other side. The net effect depends on the balance. How much destructive debt is being carried? At what rate? Against what productive returns? But the principle is consistent. Productive debt builds, destructive debt extracts, and the financial position is the sum of both, compounding in opposite directions simultaneously.
The same debt instrument, same interest rate, same repayment term, same monthly obligation, produces completely different financial outcomes depending on what it's attached to. This isn't theoretical, it's mechanical, and seeing it clearly changes how every debt decision gets evaluated. Consider two people, same income, same debt amount, same interest rate. Person A uses the debt to fund a rental property. The property generates rent. The rent covers the debt service. Something is left over each month. The property appreciates over time. The equity builds. Person B uses the same debt to fund lifestyle consumption, a vehicle, furniture, experiences, things that produced value in the moment but generate no ongoing return. After 10 years, Person A has built a capital position. The debt is largely paid down. The asset has appreciated. The equity represents real wealth. Person B has no asset. The debt is retired, but nothing was built. The income that serviced the debt for a decade produced no lasting position. Same instrument, same cost, opposite outcomes, determined entirely by the function of the debt. The function also determines the psychological experience of debt. Productive debt, debt attached to something generating returns, doesn't feel the same as destructive debt.
The mortgage on the rental property is serviced by the tenant's rent. The obligation is met by the asset's production. The holder isn't using their labor income to pay for something that's not producing. The credit card balance at high interest, carrying a purchase that produced no return, is serviced entirely by the holder's labor income. Every payment comes from earned money. No asset is producing the return that covers the cost. The psychological weight is different because the structural reality is different. One debt has something on the other side. The other is just a cost with nothing returning against it. Understanding this distinction changes the questions asked before taking on debt. Not, can I afford the payment? That question produces decisions that prioritize monthly cash flow over long-term financial position. The better questions are structural. What is this debt funding? Does that thing produce a return? Is the return greater than the cost of the debt? What is the net financial effect of this instrument over the term it will be carried? These questions produce different decisions. They evaluate the function, not just the payment, the long-term position, not just the short-term cash flow. And the decisions they produce are structurally sounder than the ones driven by whether the monthly payment fits the budget. The goal isn't to avoid debt. The goal is to understand what each debt is doing and whether it's doing something that builds position over time. Debt that builds position is worth carrying, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the balance feels large, even when the conventional advice says to pay it off. Debt that extracts wealth, that carries a high rate against a depreciating asset or a purchase that produced no return, is worth eliminating as fast as possible. Not because debt is bad, because that specific debt is doing the wrong thing, taking from the position rather than building it. The instrument is neutral. The function determines everything. Subscribe if this reframed something you've been thinking about differently. Like this if it shifted your perspective.
Credit is the most widely available financial leverage instrument most people will ever have access to. More accessible than investment capital, more accessible than business financing, more accessible than any other mechanism that allows someone to deploy resources beyond what they currently possess. And it's almost universally misused. Not because people are irresponsible, because the context in which most people encounter credit, consumer spending, lifestyle financing, the convenience of buy now, pay later, is precisely the context in which credit destroys wealth rather than building it. The instrument is neutral. The context determines the outcome. Leverage through credit means using borrowed capital to control or fund something that generates a return above the cost of the borrowing. A mortgage that funds a property generating income above the debt service, leverage working productively. A business line of credit deployed into inventory or operations that generate revenue with margins above the interest cost, leverage working productively. A credit card used to fund consumption, entertainment, dining, convenience purchases, with a balance carried month to month, leverage working destructively. The distinction is the return on the other side. Productive leverage has something generating a return. Destructive leverage has nothing, just the ongoing cost of the borrowed capital. The amplification property of leverage is what makes it both powerful and dangerous. Leverage amplifies returns. A smaller capital input controlling a larger asset earns returns on the full asset value. But leverage also amplifies losses.
The same mechanism that inflates returns when things go well, inflates losses when they don't. And leverage amplifies mistakes. A decision that would have been a small error with personal capital becomes a larger error when borrowed capital is involved. The interest continues regardless of performance. The obligation doesn't pause while the investment recovers. The cost compounds whether the asset is performing or not. This is why structural discipline is the prerequisite for productive leverage, not an optional addition to it. Leverage deployed without discipline doesn't just underperform, it accelerates the underperformance. It makes the mistake more expensive. It adds a compounding cost to an already costly error. Leverage deployed with discipline into positions with clear return above the borrowing cost, with adequate reserves to service the debt through periods of underperformance, with a clear exit or payoff structure, is a fundamentally different instrument. Same borrowed capital, same interest rate, different outcome, determined entirely by the discipline of the deployment. The people who build significant financial positions through credit are not the ones who borrowed the most. They're the ones who borrowed deliberately, for specific purposes, with clear return expectations, with the structural discipline to service the debt through the inevitable periods of uncertainty, and who used the leverage to control assets they couldn't have controlled with personal capital alone. The credit was always available. The discipline to use it correctly is what separated the position it built from the position it destroyed.
The relationship most people have with credit is fundamentally reactive. Credit is used when something is needed that current cash can't cover. The car needs replacing, the expense arrived unexpectedly, the purchase feels urgent, and the cash isn't there. Credit fills the gap between what's needed and what's available. This is the most common use of credit, and it's the use that produces the most damaging outcomes. Because it's reactive, because it's consumption-driven, because there's nothing on the other side generating a return against the cost. The people who use credit to build wealth use it proactively, not to fill gaps in cash, to access positions they've already identified as worth accessing. The distinction is in the sequence. Reactive credit. Need arises, credit deployed. Proactive credit. Position identified, credit deployed deliberately. The reactive user is responding to circumstances. The proactive user is executing a plan. And the plan has a return expectation, a clear understanding of what the borrowed capital will generate relative to what it costs. Wealthy individuals use credit as a capital efficiency tool. Rather than deploying personal capital into every position and thereby limiting the number of positions that can be held simultaneously, they use credit to access positions while personal capital is deployed elsewhere. The mortgage on the investment property allows personal capital to remain available for the next opportunity. The business line of credit funds operations during a growth period without requiring the owner to liquidate other positions. The credit card rewards on business expenses, paid in full each month, generate value on spending that was going to happen anyway. In each case, credit is being used as an instrument of capital efficiency, not as a substitute for capital that doesn't exist. The other significant difference is in how the cost of credit is evaluated. Most people evaluate credit by whether the payment is affordable. Can I make this monthly payment? Does it fit the budget? Is this manageable? Wealthy individuals evaluate credit by the spread. What does this capital cost? What does the position it funds generate? Is the return above the cost? By how much? Is that spread sufficient to justify the risk? The payment is almost irrelevant. The spread is everything. $1 million mortgage at 4%
funding a position generating 8% has a 4% spread. It's producing more than it costs. The payment is simply the mechanism through which the cost is serviced. This shift from evaluating affordability to evaluating the spread is the fundamental difference in how credit gets used. One produces consumption funded by debt, the other produces position funded by leverage. The instrument is the same. The framework applied to the decision is different, and the framework produces completely different financial trajectories from the same access to credit.
This channel exists for people who want to understand how things actually work. Subscribe if that's you. Leverage amplifies outcomes in both directions, which means the discipline required to use it productively isn't optional. It's the variable that determines whether the leverage builds or destroys. And discipline in this context isn't a character trait. It's a structural framework, a set of specific requirements that have to be met before leverage is deployed and maintained while it's carried. The first structural requirement is a clear return expectation. Before any credit is used productively, before any borrowed capital is deployed into any position, the expected return of that position has to be clearly established. Not optimistically, conservatively. What does this position generate under realistic operating assumptions? What does it generate under stressed ones? Is the return above the borrowing cost in both scenarios? If the return only exceeds the borrowing cost under optimistic assumptions, the leverage is a bet on the optimistic case. And bets funded by borrowed capital compound the cost of being wrong. The second structural requirement is adequate debt service capacity. The position funded by leverage has to generate enough income to service the debt, with enough margin to absorb disruption. Not break-even debt service, meaningful cushion above break-even. A rental property where the rent barely covers the mortgage, with no cushion for vacancy or maintenance, is a leveraged position with no structural tolerance for disruption. Any vacancy, any unexpected maintenance cost, any reduction in rental income immediately creates a shortfall that has to be covered from personal capital. And personal capital covering a shortfall on a leveraged position is capital not being deployed elsewhere, capital being consumed by the leverage rather than built by it. The third structural requirement is a clear servicing plan. How will this debt be serviced over time? From what income sources? What happens if those sources are disrupted? What reserves exist to bridge a disruption without compromising the position? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the structural requirements of any responsibly deployed leverage. The people who get into trouble with leverage are almost always the ones who deployed it without answering these questions, who assumed the position would perform as expected in every period, and who had no structural response when reality diverged from the assumption. The discipline isn't in the decision to use leverage. It's in the structure around the leverage, the reserves, the cash flow cushion, the servicing plan, that determines whether the position survives the inevitable periods of underperformance. Leverage without structure is financial fragility dressed up as ambition. It produces positions that work in good conditions and collapse in bad ones. Leverage with structure is a deliberate tool for building position, one that survives disruption because the disruption was anticipated and planned for. The difference between the two isn't access to better opportunities. It's the discipline of the framework applied before and during the deployment. The leverage is the same. The structure around it determines everything that follows. Using credit as a building tool rather than a consumption tool requires a fundamentally different relationship with borrowed capital. Not a different amount of willpower, not a different level of financial sophistication, a different framework applied consistently that evaluates every use of credit against the same structural questions. The framework starts with a simple distinction. Is this credit funding something that generates a return? If yes, what is the return? What is the borrowing cost? Is the spread sufficient? If no, is this a necessary expense that can't be deferred? Or is this discretionary consumption being funded by debt? The framework doesn't prohibit using credit. It requires that every use of credit be evaluated against these questions before the commitment is made. For credit used in productive positions, the evaluation is mathematical. The mortgage on the investment property. What does the property generate net of costs? What does the mortgage cost? Is the spread positive? Is the spread sufficient to justify the risk? The business line of credit. What revenue does the deployment generate? At what margin? Is the margin above the interest cost? By enough to justify the leverage? These aren't complicated calculations, but they require doing the calculation, rather than deciding based on whether the payment feels manageable. The payment manageability is the minimum threshold. The spread is the actual decision criterion. For credit used in non-productive contexts, the framework requires honesty. Consumer spending on credit is not inherently wrong. Credit cards paid in full each month have no interest cost. They generate rewards. They build credit history. The problem isn't using credit for consumption. The problem is carrying a balance, paying interest on consumption that generated no return. The discipline is in the payment behavior, not in whether credit is used at all. Use credit for the spending that was going to happen. Pay it in full each month. Never pay interest on consumption. Reserve the interest-paying capacity for productive deployments only. The broader principle is positioning. Credit maintained in a strong state, a high score, low utilization, clean payment history, is an asset in a ready state. Not a number to be proud of, an instrument available for deployment when the right productive opportunity appears. The investor who maintains a strong credit profile while keeping utilization low, keeping no consumer balances, preserving the borrowing capacity, is positioned to access productive leverage when the opportunity requires it, at the best available terms, without the profile being compromised by consumer debt competing for the same capacity. The credit profile is the instrument. Its strength determines the terms on which leverage is available. Its availability determines whether the productive opportunity can be accessed when it appears. Maintaining it deliberately, not for the trophy but for the deployment, is the last piece of using credit as a building tool rather than a consumption one. If this changed how you're thinking about credit, subscribe. Like this if something landed differently. Most people think of the credit system as something that evaluates them, a judgment, a score that reflects their financial responsibility, a number that tells the world whether they're trustworthy with money. That framing is understandable, but it's not accurate, and the inaccuracy produces a specific kind of misuse that costs people real money. The credit system was built by lenders, for lenders. Its primary function is risk assessment, determining the probability that a borrower will repay a debt based on their historical behavior with debt. The credit score is a risk metric, a number that tells lenders how likely they are to get their money back, and therefore what interest rate they should charge to compensate for the risk of lending it. Higher score, lower perceived risk,
lower interest rate offered. Lower score, higher perceived risk, higher interest rate required to justify the lending decision. The system is optimized for the lender's ability to price risk, not for the borrower's financial well-being. Understanding this changes how the credit system gets related to. Most people relate to their credit score as a reflection of their financial character. They feel good when it's high. They feel shame when it's low. They treat improving it as a moral project, evidence that they're becoming a more responsible person. This emotional relationship produces irrational behavior. People make financial decisions optimized for the score rather than for their actual financial position. Keeping a credit card balance because they've heard it helps the score? It doesn't. Avoiding closing unused cards because they fear the score will drop? Sometimes right, often wrong, and rarely the most important variable in the decision. Applying for new credit at the wrong time, before a major purchase, because they didn't understand how inquiries affect the score temporarily. The score is a tool with a specific function: access to credit and the rate at which that credit is offered. That's what the score actually does. It determines the terms on which borrowed capital is available. A higher score means cheaper borrowed capital, lower interest rates on mortgages, better terms on business financing, more favorable conditions on the debt instruments that fund productive financial moves. That's the financial value of a strong credit profile, not the trophy, the access and the rate. Most people who interact with the credit system are doing so reactively, checking the score when something affects it, worrying about it before a major application, trying to improve it without a clear understanding of which variables move it and which don't. The people who use the credit system effectively interact with it proactively. They understand the mechanics, which variables matter, how they're weighted, what behavior moves them efficiently, and they manage those variables deliberately. Not to feel good about the number, to ensure the number reflects a profile that gives them access to the cheapest possible borrowed capital when they need it. The system wasn't built for them, but they understand it well enough to use it anyway.
Most people know their credit score matters. Fewer understand what actually determines it, and the gap between knowing it matters and understanding what moves it is where most credit optimization goes wrong. Credit scores are calculated from 5 primary variables: payment history, credit utilization, length of credit history, credit mix, new credit inquiries. These 5 variables are not equally weighted, and the weighting is where most people's intuition about credit gets them into trouble. Payment history is the most heavily weighted variable, roughly 35% of the score in most major scoring models. Late payments, especially those 30 or more days late, damage the score more than almost anything else, and the damage persists for years. The single most important credit behavior is paying every obligation on time, every time, without exception. Not because of the score specifically, but because late payments are the single most damaging event in the credit profile, disproportionately costly relative to every other behavior. Credit utilization is the second most significant variable, approximately 30% of the score. Utilization measures the ratio between the credit currently being used and the total credit available. A person with $10,000 in available credit carrying a $2,000 balance is at 20% utilization. Most scoring models reward lower utilization, ideally below 30%, with the best scores typically reflecting utilization below 10%. This variable is also the most immediately responsive to behavior. Pay down a balance, utilization drops.
score improves relatively quickly, which makes it the most efficient lever for someone looking to move their score in a short time frame. The remaining three variables, length of history, credit mix, new inquiries, are less impactful individually, but matter in aggregate. Length of history rewards age. Older accounts in good standing contribute positively, which is why closing old accounts is often a mistake, even if they're not being actively used. Credit mix rewards variety. Revolving credit, credit cards, alongside installment credit, mortgages, auto loans, signals that the borrower can manage different types of debt obligations. New inquiries create a temporary dip. Each hard inquiry, triggered by applying for new credit, has a small negative effect that typically resolves within a year. The implications of this are practical. Don't apply for new credit in the period before a major borrowing event, a mortgage application, a business loan, when the score needs to be at its strongest. Understanding the weighting changes the behavior. Most people focus on the wrong variables, worrying about whether to close an old card, concerned about a single inquiry, missing the fact that their utilization, the second most important variable, is sitting at 60 or 70%. The efficient path to a strong credit profile prioritizes the highest weighted variables first. Pay on time, always. Keep utilization low. Let the history age. Don't apply for credit you don't need. Simple in principle, consistently under-executed in practice, because most people are managing the score emotionally rather than mechanically.
If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. There's more coming. There's a specific behavioral pattern that emerges when people relate to credit scores as trophies rather than tools. They optimize for the number rather than for the outcome the number is supposed to produce. And that distinction, optimizing for the score versus optimizing for access, produces decisions that are technically credit conscious but financially irrational. The first common misoptimization is carrying a balance to build credit. This belief is widespread, that keeping a small balance on a credit card rather than paying it off in full demonstrates credit utilization in a way that improves the score. It's wrong. Paying the balance in full each month does not hurt the score. Carrying a balance doesn't help it, and at any meaningful interest rate, it costs real money for no benefit. The belief persists because utilization is a real variable, and people conflate utilization being measured with carrying a balance being necessary. Utilization is measured based on what the balance shows at reporting time, not based on whether interest is being paid. Using the card and paying in full each month demonstrates utilization without paying a dollar in interest. The second misoptimization is closing paid-off credit cards. The intuition is understandable. The debt is paid, the card is no longer needed. Why keep it open? Because closing it reduces available credit, which increases utilization on remaining balances, and removes history from the profile that contributes to the length variable. Both effects are negative for the score. Neither is catastrophic, but they're unnecessary costs paid for no financial benefit. The better approach, for most people in most situations, is to keep the card open, use it occasionally for a small purchase, and pay it off immediately. This maintains the available credit, preserves the history, and demonstrates utilization without carrying a balance. The third misoptimization is treating the score as the end goal. A credit score of 800 is not a financial achievement. It's a tool in a ready state. The financial achievement is what the score enables: the mortgage at a lower rate, the business financing on better terms,
the access to capital that funds a productive financial move. An investor who has an 800 credit score and never uses it to access productive capital hasn't done anything with the tool. The score sitting unused is like a hammer that never drives a nail. The point isn't the score. The point is the access it provides, and whether that access is being used to build something. Most people's relationship with credit is either neglectful or misguided. Neglectful, not managing it at all, discovering the score matters only when it's needed for something important. Or misguided, managing it obsessively but for the wrong reasons, optimizing for the number rather than for the financial function the number serves. The more useful relationship is deliberate, understanding what the score does, managing the variables that move it efficiently, and using the access it provides at the moments when cheap, borrowed capital advances the financial position. Not a trophy to be displayed, not a source of shame to be hidden, a tool to be maintained and used when the conditions are right.
The credit system rewards a specific kind of participant. Not the most financially sophisticated, not the wealthiest, not the most disciplined in every dimension. The participant who understands what the system measures and manages those specific variables with consistent, boring, deliberate behavior over a long period of time. Deliberate credit management starts with a clear objective, not a target score, a target use case. What will this credit profile be used for? When will that use happen? What score is needed to access the best available terms for that specific purpose? Working backward from the use case produces a more focused management approach than working forward from the abstract goal of a higher score. A person planning to purchase a property in 2 years needs to know what score threshold accesses the best mortgage rates, and work backward from that threshold to identify what needs to change in the credit profile to reach it in the available time. The mechanics of deliberate management are straightforward. Pay every obligation on time, without exception. Set up autopay if necessary. Remove the human decision from the most critical variable. Keep utilization below 30%, ideally below 10% in the months before a major credit application. Don't close old accounts unless there's a compelling reason, an annual fee that isn't justified. Otherwise, let the history accumulate. Don't apply for new credit in the period before a major application. Each hard inquiry creates a temporary dip at the moment when the score needs to be strongest. And use the credit available. A credit card paid in full each month demonstrates utilization, builds history, and costs nothing. A card sitting unused builds history, but demonstrates nothing. The deliberate user of credit also understands the strategic timing of credit applications. Applying for new credit when the profile is strongest, after a period of low utilization, with no recent inquiries, with a long history of on-time payments, produces better terms than applying at any other time. Better terms mean lower rates. Lower rates on productive debt mean more of the return stays with the borrower rather than going to the lender. The timing of when credit is accessed is as financially significant as the creditworthiness that determines the terms. A strong profile accessed at the wrong time, when it's been recently dinged by inquiries, when utilization is temporarily elevated, produces worse terms than the same profile accessed at a moment of maximum strength. The broader principle is treating credit as a financial instrument that requires maintenance and strategic deployment, the same way any other financial instrument does. A portfolio requires maintenance, regular rebalancing, intentional allocation decisions. A credit profile requires the same.
regular monitoring, intentional management of the key variables, strategic deployment at the right moments. The people who use the credit system most effectively aren't doing anything complicated. They're doing a small number of things consistently and deliberately over a long enough period to maintain a profile that gives them access to capital on the best available terms when their financial moves require it. The system wasn't designed for them, but they've learned it well enough to use it on their own terms. Subscribe if this is the kind of clarity you've been missing. Like this if it changed how you see it.
Most people approach debt elimination the same way they approach most financial decisions, intuitively. Pay the smallest balance first, because closing an account feels like progress. Pay the highest balance first, because the biggest number feels most urgent. Pay whatever has the most emotional weight, because the emotional weight is real and it influences behavior. None of these approaches are irrational, but none of them are optimal. And the gap between the intuitive approach and the optimal one is a measurable dollar amount, real money paid in interest that didn't need to be paid. The order of debt elimination matters because of how interest compounds. Every dollar of principal on a high-interest balance is generating interest. Every month that balance exists, at whatever rate it carries, that interest is being extracted from the position. Eliminating a balance doesn't just remove the principal, it removes all future interest that principal would have generated, which means the order of elimination determines the total interest paid over the entire debt elimination period. Pay the highest rate balance first, and the most damaging compounding is stopped earliest. Pay any other balance first, and the highest rate compounding continues longer than it needed to. The difference in total interest paid between the optimal order and any other order is real, measurable, and often significant. This is the mathematical case for what's commonly called the avalanche method. Pay minimums on all balances. Apply every available dollar above the minimums to the highest interest balance. When that balance is eliminated, redirect its payment to the next highest rate. Continue until all debt is retired. The avalanche method minimizes total interest paid. It's the mathematically optimal approach to debt elimination, assuming the goal is to pay as little as possible over the entire elimination period. That assumption is usually correct, but not always. And the cases where it isn't are worth understanding. The competing approach is the snowball method. Pay minimums on all balances. Apply available dollars to the smallest balance first, regardless of rate. Eliminate it. Redirect its payment to the next smallest. Continue until all debt is retired. The snowball method doesn't minimize interest paid. It minimizes the number of open accounts, producing the psychological wins of closing accounts faster than the avalanche produces. And psychological wins matter, not as a financial variable, but as a behavioral one. A debt elimination strategy that gets abandoned because it produces no visible progress for months is structurally inferior to a strategy that costs slightly more in interest but gets executed consistently. The optimal strategy is the one that gets completed, not the one that saves the most on paper if it gets abandoned halfway through. Which means the right approach depends on an honest assessment of the individual's behavioral capacity, not just the mathematics. Someone who needs visible wins to maintain momentum may be better served by the snowball, even knowing it costs more. Someone who can sustain motivation through a long period of slow, visible progress benefits more from the avalanche. The financial difference between the two is real, but so is the behavioral difference.
and the strategy that accounts for both is the one most likely to produce the outcome both are aiming for: a position with no high-interest debt. The avalanche and the snowball are the two primary frameworks for structured debt elimination. They're often presented as competing philosophies, the mathematical approach versus the behavioral one. That framing understates the nuance. Both have structural logic. Both produce results. The question is, which produces more given the specific combination of debt and the specific behavioral tendencies of the person eliminating it? The avalanche wins on total cost. By directing maximum payment toward the highest rate, it stops the most damaging compounding first. Every month, the highest rate balance exists. It generates more interest per dollar of principal than any other balance. Eliminating it first means that rate stops compounding before any other rate does, which reduces total interest paid across all balances by more than any other sequencing would. The math is unambiguous. Given equal payments and equal time, the avalanche produces a lower total cost than the snowball in virtually every scenario. The snowball wins on behavioral compliance. Closing accounts produces a specific psychological effect. The account is gone. The minimum payment that was going to it is now available for the next target. The progress is visible. The momentum is real. For people who struggle to maintain motivation through the early phase of debt elimination, when the avalanche is producing minimal visible progress because the highest rate balance is also often the largest, the snowball provides evidence that the strategy is working earlier than the avalanche would, more visibly, more emotionally satisfying. And behavioral compliance, continuing the strategy, is the variable that determines whether either method produces results. The honest comparison looks like this. The avalanche saves more money, sometimes significantly more, depending on the rates involved and the timeline of elimination. The snowball produces faster visible wins, which may or may not matter, depending on how much visible progress affects the consistency of execution. For someone with strong behavioral consistency who doesn't need the early wins to stay on track, the avalanche is clearly superior. For someone whose consistency is genuinely dependent on momentum, the snowball's cost premium may be worth paying to ensure the strategy gets completed. The premium isn't always large. It depends on the specific balances and rates, but it's real, and it should be evaluated honestly, not rationalized as preference when it's actually a behavioral accommodation. There are also hybrid approaches. Pay off the one or two smallest balances first to simplify the debt picture and generate early wins. Then switch to the avalanche for the remaining higher rate balances. This approach gets the behavioral benefit of the snowball in the early stage, when motivation is most fragile, while capturing most of the mathematical benefit of the avalanche for the larger, higher rate balances. It's not theoretically optimal, but it's often practically optimal because it accounts for both the mathematics of interest and the reality of human behavior over a multi-year elimination period. Subscribe if you want to keep thinking about this differently. We're just getting started. The conventional framing of debt elimination presents it as a prerequisite. Pay off the debt first, then start building, then invest, then work on the financial position. This sequencing is intuitive. It feels responsible. Get clean first, then move forward. And for high-interest consumer debt, it's often structurally correct. The return available from eliminating 20% interest debt is a guaranteed 20%, which is difficult to beat with any investment in a comparable risk profile. But applied universally, to all debt regardless of rate, This sequencing is often wrong, and following it costs real money over time. The question is always about the rate, not whether to pay off debt or invest, but at what rate does paying off debt produce a higher guaranteed return than investing the same capital? Debt at 20% interest, paying it off generates a guaranteed 20% return. Very few investments produce that reliably. The math favors elimination. Debt at 3% interest, paying it off generates a guaranteed 3% return. A diversified long-term investment portfolio has historically generated significantly more than that. The math favors investing. The crossover point, the rate at which paying off debt is mathematically equivalent to investing, is somewhere in the middle. And the specific number depends on the investor's expected return and their personal risk tolerance. In practice, this means high-interest consumer debt should be eliminated aggressively. Credit cards, personal loans at high rates, any debt where the interest rate exceeds what the investor could reasonably expect from a comparable investment. And lower-rate debt, a fixed-rate mortgage, a low-rate student loan, a business loan at below-market rates, should be serviced at minimum while available capital is invested. Not because the debt doesn't matter, but because the opportunity cost of paying off low-rate debt ahead of schedule rather than investing the difference is real and compounding in the wrong direction. This requires separating the emotional from the structural. Debt feels bad. All debt, regardless of rate. The feeling of being debt-free is genuinely valuable, psychologically, if not always mathematically. But financial decisions made primarily to relieve an emotional discomfort rather than to optimize the financial position often produce structurally inferior outcomes. The person who paid off their 3% mortgage early to feel debt-free while the market returned 7 or 8%, made a decision that felt right and cost real money. The feeling was real. So was the cost. The framework that produces better decisions is rate-based, not emotion-based. Eliminate high-rate debt aggressively. Service low-rate debt while investing the difference. Never treat all debt as equivalent regardless of what it costs. The emotional instinct to be debt-free is understandable, but financial freedom isn't built by eliminating all debt as fast as possible. It's built by understanding what each debt is costing and making the decision that produces the best financial position over the relevant time horizon.
A debt elimination plan that works isn't the one with the best mathematics. It's the one that gets executed. Completely. Consistently. Over however long it takes. And execution over time requires more than a strategy. It requires a structure. One that makes the right behavior the path of least resistance rather than a continuous act of discipline. The first element of a working plan is a complete inventory. Every balance, every rate, every minimum payment, every term. Not an approximate picture, a precise one, because the sequencing decision, which balance to target first, can only be made correctly with complete information. And the psychological relationship with the total debt picture changes when it's mapped precisely. The amorphous weight of owing money without a clear view of the specifics often feels larger than it is. The precise inventory converts an emotional burden into a specific problem with a specific structure and a calculable timeline to resolution. The second element is a target sequencing decision, not a permanent commitment, a deliberate starting point, based on an honest assessment of two variables: the mathematics, which sequence minimizes interest paid, the behavioral reality,
Which sequence is most likely to be sustained? For most people, a modified avalanche that begins with one or two small wins, then shifts to rate priority, balances both variables reasonably well. The specific choice matters less than the consistency with which it's executed. The third element is automation. The debt elimination payment, above the minimum, should be automated. Not decided each month, not subject to whether the money feels available. Set up as a fixed, automatic transfer on payday, before discretionary spending, before any other allocation, taken off the table. Automation removes the behavioral decision from the most critical moment, the moment when the money is available and competing uses for it are also visible. The automatic transfer doesn't feel the temptation. It just executes the plan. The fourth element is protecting the plan from the events that derail it. An unexpected expense, a period of reduced income, a month where the payment feels impossible. These events don't just interrupt the plan temporarily, they can end it if there's no structure for how to respond to them. A small emergency fund, separate from the debt elimination capital, absorbs the unexpected expenses without requiring the debt elimination payment to be skipped. A predetermined response to a period of income reduction, which minimums stay paid, which additional payments pause temporarily, keeps the plan from collapsing entirely when conditions temporarily change. The plan that accounts for disruption survives it. The plan that assumes smooth sailing often doesn't. If this gave you a clearer picture, subscribe. Like this if something clicked.